see what you can find in Korea that will amaze you. Because when you go back to wherever you came from, I would hope that you would take back a memory of Korea that would enhance your understanding and perhaps convince you to talk in positive terms, not only about Korea, but just about life on Earth.
Welcome to the Settlers of Seoul podcast. This is Arius Dare. On the first SOS episode of 2018, we're speaking with John Nowell. John has lived in Korea since 1965 and has been a first-hand witness to the economic and political transformation of South Korea from a poor backwater to a global powerhouse. He's worked for the U.S. Army, the Ambassador Hotel, and even Laurie's Steakhouse for a time. This episode is a joint collaboration between Settlers of Seoul and Yongsan Legacy Project. We touch on this a bit in the interview, but for those unaware, most military and civilian personnel will be vacating Yongsan and permanently relocating about 90 minutes south of Seoul to Camp Humphreys in Pyeongtaek. The people behind Yongsan Legacy are working to capture the historical and cultural legacy of Yongsan Garrison and archive historical facts, stories, and memories of the site. To learn more about this, please visit www.yongsanlegacy.org. All right, let's get to it. John Nowell, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, John, how long have you been in Korea?
Well, let's put it this way. I came in 65, but in the ensuing years, with a few trips to the United States for a little bit of a length of a time, I've lived in Korea, say, 50 years out of 53 years.
What brought you out here in 65?
Well, I was working for Bank of America, trying to become a bank officer on a 2-year intern program, when I got this letter from the then President Lyndon Baines Johnson saying, "We need your services in the military. Please report to the nearest Army reception center."
He was nice enough to extend you an invite.
Yes, it was an invitation, but one that you couldn't really refuse.
Now, when you think of drafting in the 1960s, you typically think of Vietnam. Ken Burns just recently released an excellent documentary that I encourage all of our listeners to check out. But how was it that you ended up in South Korea and not Vietnam?
Well, actually, it didn't get hot and heavy in Vietnam until March of 65. I was hoping to go to Europe because other people were going to France because we still had troops in France at the time. And I came down for Korea, and I said, "Korea, where's Korea?" And I didn't know, just, off the top of my head. My geography in high school wasn't that great. Yeah. So, but in the reception station, they had to bunk us and get us, situated. Came back and they said, "Okay, we're looking for volunteers." Well, nobody's put their hand up. Volunteer for what? "We need 3 clerk typists." I immediately raised my hand because I had taken clerk typing in high school in my sophomore year.
That's right. I guess it wasn't a widespread skill at that point.
No, there was only 2 of us, 2 guys in our typing class at Anaheim Union High School. And but I'm glad I took the class because I got selected. Therefore, my MOS was changed to administration from artillery. So I only spent 1 night in a foxhole, by the way.
Behind the typewriter lines, I guess.
Yeah.
Can you just describe the scenery of driving through Korea, less than 15 years removed from the Korean War, a third world country? I'm sure that for many of these kids, if you saw it, you would have been the first non-Korean that they had ever seen. What was that drive like?
Well, when we were leaving Incheon, when we arrived, they gave us a sack lunch. And this is 5 January now. So there's snow, there's ice all around. And they said, "Don't throw your lunch out the window." I said, "Wait a minute, it can't be that bad of food." No, that wasn't.
I didn't cook this.
But what it was a sack lunch, carton of milk, pint and sandwich and some stuff, and apple or banana, whatever they had, fruit at the time. And why would I want to throw my sack lunch out the window? I'm hungry. But we looked out the window, and what did we see? We saw these kids scantily clad in January, some of them with underwear. They weren't wearing any clothes. It was underwear, maybe, only a shirt and no pants. I mean, my God, I'm just astounded. And of course, we threw our lunches out the window because we saw these basically starving kids. And they were all along the railroad track just waiting for this lunch because others had done it before. But their concern was a safety factor. If you threw the lunch out and it fell down embankment on the rail line, the kids would fight each other to get the food, and then some kid might get injured on the train. And so we threw the thing as far as we could to make sure it was away from the railroad track. And these kids were all running to get that that lunch bag. Yeah, it was a sad vision for me. And of course, that was on the initial thing. But when we got into Tongdushan, Tongdushan was just a village in a farming area that was built up because of the presence of the U.S. military. People came there to do whatever kind of jobs they could do. You know, we had houseboys. Mm-hmm. We had a houseboy. I think I paid $2 a month for the houseboy, and we had 12 in our hooch. So he got, 2 times 12 was $24 a month. That was pretty good pay. Yeah, that was sad because my net pay was $56 as a PFC.
Right.
So, and this guy was making $24.
Well, so he's got to pay for housing and everything else, though.
Well, but the thing is that people downtown were not making that kind of money. Mm-hmm. So a houseboy really was a plush job, and they would shine our shoes. They would, clean the floor. They would make our bunks, take care of the Quonset while we were out working.
Right. And so how long did you work as a typist?
I had taken an administrative position. So the first 8 months, 7 months, I was a clerk typist there at Camp Casey. And then I had this notice that my transfer had come through, and I said, but I don't have a job. It doesn't say where I'm going to go. So I called this Spec 5 who was in Yongsan, who I had been talking to regarding new arriving personnel who would come in, and then I would reassign them. And so I knew who I could talk to, and I said to him, is there a job somewhere in Seoul that I could be reassigned to? And he says, John, you can have my job. I want to go to Camp Market in Bupyeong. I said, you take my job, then it frees me up. I can take the job over there that I've wanted to transfer to. I said, my God, how could this be? And so that's what happened. I got a transfer to take his job, and my commander was Captain Miller.
Can you maybe paint the picture of what it would be walking down your typical street in Seoul in the 1960s?
I would walk down the street, and then I would see a streetcar. Clang, 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 just like in San Francisco. I rode the streetcar.
What downtown. Color was it?
It was kind of a brown and yellow, light colored brown and yellow. And but it would go from Noryangjin, south of the river, all the way across and then through town over to Dongdaemun. Yeah, that's how we traveled, was by that. They did have taxis. Sayonara taxi, not sayonara, Sayonara taxis, and they were not expensive at all. But walking was a lot of what I did. And I would walk from Yongsan Garrison to downtown, down to the railroad station.
Now, by that point, they had sidewalks and paved roads in the downtown area.
Well, yes, they did, but they also had oxen pulling carts in Seoul City.
On the way to Dongdaemun from Yongsan.
Well, there's a picture of an oxen right in front of Dongdaemun. I have that photo. Yeah, somebody took it.
We'll put that up in the show notes. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I've got that on a slide or something.
How did people react to you? I assume that you were going out in uniform.
Well, in Seoul, we could go out in civilian attire. In other camps, they had to wear their Class B. We were a curious bunch. Anybody who was Caucasian or African American in appearance would be assumed to be U.S. personnel with the military. And not many people spoke English, so you didn't get a lot of people coming around you. And if you're walking on the sidewalk, somebody might bump into you, but there was no excuse me or any of that.
Well, I don't know how much that has changed.
It was very impersonal. But if you made eye contact, then people might step out of your way. But usually they didn't make eye contact. Normally it was just, barrel through. But there were a lot of noises in the city. There was the ox-pulled cart, and some of these carts were hauling produce or some supply good, but there were the honey buckets.
All right.
Yeah, the oxen was pulling this cart, and the guy, leading it, would get off occasionally, stop at some, facility, a single family quarters or whatever, and he'd have this long-handled bucket at the end, and he would scoop out human manure, from the pienso, and load it into the bucket on this cart, and they would take that out in the countryside and put it on the fields. So human manure was used to fertilize a lot of the produce in Korea back in those days, before the advent of a lot of,
chemical fertilizers.
Chemical fertilizers,
others.
Right. But, they say that human fertilized rice tastes better than the other fertilized rice.
Can you attest to that?
I don't know. I mean, I ate white rice, but I
suppose it's possible.
I ate barley as well.
Yeah, right.
The Koreans didn't have good money to just eat rice. They had to eat barley. Barley was cheaper.
What other kind of food did you eat? Korean food back then that you remember?
Well, I was introduced, of course, to bulgogi and kimchi, but I'm not a kimchi lover. I didn't eat Mexican hot, spicy foods, so I had no taste for the Korean hot, spicy foods.
Is that still the case?
There's certain kimchis I like. Spring kimchi, or what they call foot kimchi, very mild. So that kind of a kimchi I'm okay with. But any spicy, really dicey, peppery stuff I don't care for. Whether it's kimchi or something else, I don't like peppery food or spicy dishes.
Was it easy to get meat off base back then?
Sadly, there was a black market for foods brought into through the military channels, whether it was the commissary or wherever it was, and that was popular in Namdaemun, and that was a problem. It has been a problem for many, many years. It was even brought out during the '88 Olympics that some NBC TV crews went out and covered something like that, like they did about the Poshingak, the dog meat restaurants. Yeah.
Was there a point that you really decided, or at least you felt, that Korea was going to be where you spent most of the rest of your life, at least up to this point? I'm kind of curious, like, what was your impression of the country then? Did you think, I can't wait to get out? Was it intriguing? Walk us through your thoughts, walking down that street and going for bulgogi.
Well, to be quite frank, when I first arrived in Korea and had an opportunity to go off post, I didn't. When I saw the country, I said, I couldn't give you 2 nickels for this place. It just doesn't look like it's going anywhere. And for the first month and a half, I didn't go into the Ville. Everybody called it the Ville, the village, in Tongdushan. And we were told there's communists out there, prostitution, there's all kinds of good things. Well, that wasn't attractive to me. And so one night I was on guard duty, and we have Katusas, Korean augmentation to the U.S. Army.
Right.
And I met this one Katusa. We went into the Quonset to get warm by the potbelly stove. And it was so hot that you were rotating yourself. You'd be the front, you'd turn to get your back, you'd go to the front, you go to the back. You're kind of like roasting, but it was so cold outside. And this was in February, so it was still really cold. And this Katusa said to me, "What is your name?" Perfect English. I hadn't experienced that before, with people around the compound, the houseboys and so on. And I looked at him and said, "My name is John." He said, "Me too." "What? Your name is John?" He says, "Well, no, it's not John. It's Johann. But in the Bible, Johann is John."
Right.
And so, but his pronunciation was so clear, so good. And I got to talking to him, found out that he had graduated from Hanguk Wedehak, which is called the Korean Foreign Language Institute. Yeah.
Right.
And in French literature, no less. And he's the son of a pastor, a Presbyterian pastor. Well, it sounded cool. He said, "Have you been into the Ville yet?" I said, No, I haven't been. And I told him why. And he said, "Oh, are you free this coming Saturday?" "I don't have anything to do. I'd like to take you in and show you how the Koreans live." I said, "That sounds interesting." So that Saturday, we went into Tongdushan, not to the bar in the Ville area,
Right.
but where the Koreans, lived and sent their kids to school and things like that. And we went to a movie theater. And I don't remember the movie itself, but I'm sure it was probably John Wayne, and the
classic Korean character.
Yeah, and the Korean characters are on the bottom of the script. I mean, the movie. So but he didn't need that. He could speak perfect English.
Yeah.
So the two of us had really enjoyed the movie, and he said, hey, then let's go have some bulgogi and rice and kimchi. And I said, okay. That was my first introduction to the kimchi and makgeolli. And so I loved it.
Stayed for the makgeolli.
The bulgogi was fantastic. The rice was great. It was different than the kind of rice that I had back home in the way it was prepared. We used to put hot rice and then sugar and butter. I got to go back to the makgeolli.
Always comes back to the makgeolli.
Well, because they served it in a bowl and they poured it out, and I looked at it and I said to myself, this looks like starch. And then tupshida. So I took a little sip and I said to myself, tastes like starch. So nonetheless, I was not impressed with makgeolli. Actually, I wasn't much of an alcoholic person.
Well, you'd only been in Korea for a very short amount of time then. There's still much to learn.
Much to learn, right.
About alcoholism.
But really, I was not turned on to makgeolli. But the bulgogi and the rice, great. And what it did was it made me do 180-degree turn. A 180-degree. I no longer felt contained inside the camp walls. Now I could go out, and I wasn't a stranger to the things I could see. And because I got outside and I got to see how the Korean people were so labor intensive in what they were doing and so focused in what they were doing, I became interested because I thought of my father, who was born in 1920 and lived in the 30s when America went through its, worst days economically. And so I thought, this is my 30s. And so I felt like I could learn a lot from this. And then I thought, well, just the common knowledge stuff I know in the U.S., I could tell these people to enhance their life. So it wasn't something I invented. We do this in the U.S. So here's something maybe, you guys should think about. And so I just had a newfound interest in the assignment, not just a soldier, but there is something I could do. And so I really felt I could contribute. And this is something I think that there's a lot of soldiers that come over here for whatever reason. They may stay on the compound or go to the Ville. That may be the extent of their tour. And they go back to America after a year, and people talk to them. Where have you been? Where did you go? I went into the Ville. What's the Ville? Oh, Tongdushan, TDC, abbreviated.
Right.
Or whatever camp it might be, whatever village it might be adjacent to it. And so what kind of an experience did they really have? Now, there were some occasions where the unit was sponsoring an orphanage or a crippled children's home or an old folks home, or maybe they were contributing for a leprosy colony. So there were opportunities where we could go out and give some help to people who really needed it.
Did you find that other enlisted men and women shared your sentiments, and were you able to connect with like-minded individuals and kind of collaborate your efforts together?
Well, I didn't stay at Camp Casey long enough to do that. I was there from January until July when I went to attend my sister's wedding, and when I come back in August, I got the transfer to Yongsan. So it wasn't until I got to Yongsan that I really could meet with folks with a like-minded interest, because we had that flexibility to go off post more frequently.
I see.
And be involved in a lot more activities, because Yongsan Garrison was the center of everything. The headquarters for the United Nations Command, the United States Forces Korea, 8th United States Army, and all other major elements had their headquarters stationed at Yongsan.
And geographically, it's right in the middle of Seoul.
It's in the heart of the city. Now, having said it's in the heart of the city, at that time, there were 9 gu that make up Seoul City. And if that was like New York, you'd say 9 borough,
Right.
9 districts.
And now there's 20 something.
Right, 27, I think. And the cheaper residences were maintained in Yeongdong-po. That's where all the trash was taken. That's where, the hard work.
That's right. Yeouido was a landfill, if I remember correctly.
Well, Yeouido was the Seoul airport. Not I don't want to say Seoul airport in the sense that was a big thing. It wasn't. K-16 had their facilities on Yeouido at that time. And so we had our aircraft taking off and landing there, helicopter and fixed wing. The population of Seoul was 3.2 million in 1966. Now it's over 10 million, surrounded by another 15 million in the surrounding communities. So there's 25 million in this one area of South Korea. That's half the entire population. But in those days, transportation was, there was no cluster of automobiles on the road because people didn't have their own individual cars. That didn't come about until 1980 when the My Car thing hit.
And the Hyundai Pony, I believe, was the first mass manufactured Hyundai car.
Well, yes, but the little Gia truck was the first.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the little 3-wheel truck.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they were like 4 different sizes.
I think they have one of those at the Contemporary Museum of History.
Yeah. That was interesting. I brought my father and mother over here in 1973, and my father's not a mechanic, so a lot of things appealed to him. We had a cabin at the Techon Missionary Beach down south, and drove them down there, and they would see all of this work ethic by the Korean people, rebuilding dirt roads with gravel and then cement or asphalt. And my father, he observed these elderly women that had these thick hemp aprons, and they had would come from where they had the stones. Some man would shovel the stones in their apron. The women would walk about 15 yards and drop those stones on the roadway, and then would smooth it all out, and then they would put asphalt on top of that. And he just saw the work ethic of the Korean people. There was no trash around. Cans, bottles, you name it, they were recycled. And the young kids would bring glass bottles or plastic or whatever and cans and give it to the Yutjangsa. The Yutjangsa with this guy walking around with these heavy shears, and they were clanking, clink, 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 to let them know he's in the neighborhood. And these kids would hear that, and they'd grab up their empty bottles and glasses and whatever and take it to him for recycling. And then he'd take the shears and knock off a huge piece of this rice rock candy. And the kids got the rock candy for their effort. But this was
for candy.
Yeah, but this was kind of a noise nuisance to some. The mayor of Seoul, they called him Bulldozer Kim, he signed an edict that the noise nuisance law would be in effect November 1968. That included banning all ox-pulled carts from the city. It also eliminated the streetcar. The Yutjangsa couldn't clank his shears like he did, not in the city limits. And the Mudang could not conduct their sorcerous exercise, to rid the evil spirits from a sick person, because it was a clanging of...
A necessary practice, after all.
Well, they were clanging, cymbals and beating drums, and the neighbors would hear this because it was pretty loud. So they banned all of those things from the city limits. At nighttime, there was a guy who had wooden blocks that would clank them together, and he was like a security guard, letting everybody know that there's no thieves in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
But it was stuff like that that just was all over the place. But you don't have that. The other thing, there was these guys walking with these two-wheel carts, and then in the back of the carts, they had these coal briquettes. They had all 19 holes in these briquettes.
And these were used for heating.
This was used for heating, for cooking in they called the kitchen the puok. Mm-hmm. And in the puok, they had this cemented area with center holes cut, and you drop the 19-hole briquette down in the bottom. After putting a little burning charcoal at the bottom to get them started, you put a second one on top so that the heat from the other one would transfer into the other one. So every 6 hours, they would have to take the one off that was half burnt, take the one that's suspended out, put the half burnt one back in, put a new one on top of that. Every 6 hours, you had to do that to keep the heat going. And then the flues took the heat from the kitchen through the floors, which we'll call ondo floors.
Yeah.
And people slept on those floors or had their meals. I mean, you slept in the floor, you had your meals on that same floor. There were no chairs, and there was a small table that they put the food on. But this flue would go out across the length of the room, outside of the building. And so they used that heating for cooking and heating the room for sleep. But there was and then for us in the military, we had announcements on AFN radio that if you're sleeping in an ondo floor, a heated facility, make sure the windows are open so that carbon monoxide could not come in and kill you while you're asleep.
Right.
And that nearly happened to me one
Really?
time. Yeah. I woke up with a tremendous headache, just happened to need to go to the restroom when I woke up, and I realized what was happening. The window was closed. So I had to open the window and make sure that everybody was out of the house. So it was, it's kind of scary. It happened one time for me, but I mean, you only have to have it happen one time to kill you. So, even there's some people today using the 19-hole briquettes, lower income level around cities.
Right. So at what point did you decide that you wanted to stay? You talk about the bulgogi diplomacy, kind of seeing these older women working very, very hard, seeing how industrious these people were with relatively little resources at the time compared to where you had grown up. When did you decide that this is the place for me? This is where I want to call home?
Well, I had in my capacity as a soldier at Yongsan, ran into several civilians. And one guy was on the same floor. We're on the second floor of that building, as I mentioned. I saw him, his coat and tie, and I said, "Excuse me, sir, what do you do?" He says, "Well, I'm a civil affairs officer. I try to enhance the military relationship for America with Koreans through various projects that are funded through the American Korean AFAC program, Armed Forces Assistance to Korea, I should say." And I said, "Well, may I ask how long you've been here?" He says, 3 years. 3 years? And I almost fell down. And I said, "Gee, how do you become a civilian?" He said, "Well, I was hired from the United States, but there are some soldiers who get out of the service here, apply through the Civilian Personnel Office for an exam to, qualify for being a civil servant." And I said, "Boy, that sounds interesting to me." And so I thought, I'd like to take a shot at that, be a civilian over here. Don't have to salute all the time.
You could have done that in other countries. Why did you want to stay here?
Well, I don't know. I just felt like, my ancestry includes Cherokee Indians. And in reading up about Korea and about the Indians in America, I realized that from Asia came this new breed of people into North America who stayed. And then some went on down to South America. But the Cherokee Indian had an emblem, a good luck charm. The very same good luck charm I found on the Buddhist temples over here. And they would carry their babies on their backs, pretty much like the Indians did. And I thought, geez, I might have, Korean blood running through my veins. I was just astounded at all of this.
You discovered your inner Korean, truly.
Yeah, but I never did learn how to speak Cherokee or write Cherokee. But my great-grandmother was half Cherokee, and I met her in Oklahoma in 1946 or 47. And I have this vague memory of her, and it stuck with me. And so I champion the American Indian. I champion anyone who's come to America to live a better life. And I felt like the Koreans here have treated me far better than I deserve. I was, I learned about Confucianism. I learned about the way that it's a perpendicular line. It's from subject to king, son to father, wife to husband. It's all perpendicular. And I thought about that, and I said, gee, that's why these people relate the way they do. Whereas I come from a Christian nation, which basically says you're all on the same plane,
right?
A horizontal plane. You're all equal. And also, when I came, Park Chung-hee was the president, and people were very careful about what they said, because the Korean Central Intelligence Agency had agents all around watching out for communism and communist efforts and so on. So people were very careful to talk and say what they really thought. If I'd meet with 3 Koreans, the senior of those 3 would do all the talking. When that person left, if there were just 2, still the senior of the 2 would do the talking. But when that person left this single person, then that guy could talk to me what he wanted to say, but not in the presence of the other 2.
Right.
And I found that very strange. In the Confucian philosophy, the people at home were teaching their children not to laugh or cry outside of the house. You might do that inside the house, but you don't show your emotions outside. So, later on, as a civilian, I went to work for Civil Affairs, G5 at that time, for 8th Army. Mm-hmm. And our task was to go out to the installations, meet with the commanders who would host a Korean-American Friendship Council meeting. They call them KAFC now, but back then it was called Community Relations Advisory Councils. And that sounded kind of demeaning to the Koreans, that the Americans were advising them.
Yeah.
And so when we got to these crack councils, CRAC, my job was to sit there in the meetings and observe the Americans and the Koreans and how they interrelated. And I could tell that one side, the Koreans were all sitting upright, proper, with their hands on their legs. The other side, the Americans, were sitting straddle, legs crossed, chewing gum, and in many cases not paying attention at all. The Korean side were all, sitting there quiet, and the head person would do all the talking. But among the Americans, they might have side conversations going on when their own commander was talking. And the Koreans observed all this. So at the end of the meeting, I would talk to the commander and I would point these observations out. And I said, you could get a lot more cooperation with the Korean if you would tell your folks how to be a little more formal.
Now, this may be a loaded question. Feel free to pass on this, but you mentioned Park Chung-hee earlier, and I think that there's no man more controversial than he in Korea. What is your take on him?
Well, I'm not involved. I'm an observer. But my feeling was that the effort by anti-Americans, anti-democracy efforts was pretty strong outside, and that in order to maintain control, you had to have a heavy hand. And that's, of course, what Park Chung-hee did. Back when Lieutenant General Hodge became the military governor of Korea in 1945, when they tried to get them to establish political parties, I was told they had something like 245 political parties. And General Hodge said, okay, guys, this isn't going to work. There's 2 parties. Choose one or the other, because it was chaos. You had different cliques. You had different provinces. You had families. You had village elders, and they all wanted to do things their way. Now they had freedom. They didn't have it under the Japanese. They didn't have it under the king because of this Confucian philosophy.
It's a brand new experiment.
Right. There were Yangban and there were Sangnam. Now the Sangnam were able to come up out of that lower class and try to talk on the same level as Yangban. And it took a lot of time. It's still going on.
Yeah. Behind
the scenes. Somebody considers himself a Yangban and everybody else is a Sangnam. And that takes time. And so those are the kinds of things that Park Chung-hee had to deal with. Park Chung-hee was the son of a farmer, but he he was, under the Japanese administration, an attendant and graduate of the Japanese West Point. So that was held against him. Well, that was held against a lot of Koreans who tried to survive. And if you're trying to take care of your family, you try to do the best you can. Syngman Rhee was very much against the Japanese, to the point that when he was in prison, I believe I read the story that they pulled his fingernails out. And when he finally got free from Korea and went to the United States, and he attended and graduated from Princeton University, and he comes back to Korea, and he becomes the first president of the Republic. He had married his Francesca, who was Austrian, and so that was held against him, that he didn't have a Korean wife. So, there's always going to be some segment of the community that doesn't like you for one reason or another.
He is largely responsible for a lot of the modern Korean nationalism that is kind of molded around anti-Japanesism.
There's a lot of animosity toward the Japanese, but I think, and maybe rightly so, for some who've lost their ancestors because of it, they really need to deal with these other nations and the policies of the other nations to make sure that the future is going to be brighter for everybody. Because if they still hold these sentiments, if they still resist change, then it's not going to be good for them or anybody. You got to have some kind of negotiation available to make it better for both sides. And so this is something that they have to really work hard at. Some of them are so entrenched in their feelings that it's hard to get past that. And we have that in the United States right now. We've got people that all upset about the removal of these Confederate statues. Well, for some, the Confederate statues represent the history of what was wrong, and that can, provide the discussion. But some people in the South say they're still right, and that they've suffered all these years because of the Yanks winning.
What was it like living through Korea's democratization in the late 1980s?
Well, with the assassination of President Park, ended the military rule, for the exception that Chun Doo-hwan soon followed and tried to implement the same thing, but he met an awful lot of resistance. He didn't have the following that Park had, but he carried it through for 7 years and then turned it over to Roh. Roh was also a former military general, but it set the stage for this transition from military to civilian control. When Kim Il-sung became the president, there was a first change from military to civilian leadership.
Were you working in civil affairs at that time, in the late 1980s?
So I was in community relations up until 1979. And the reason I say that is President Carter was going to pull us all out of Korea. And I was a GS-9.
He ran on that platform.
He did.
He really tried.
Well, I was a GS-9 at the time, and I said, wow, if they pull the troops out of Korea, maybe I need to change my job.
Right.
And so I knew a fellow that was a general manager of the Ambassador Hotel, not American. I knew the general manager, his name was Milo David, at the Ambassador Hotel. And I had helped him rewrite some of their menus in English and PR materials in English. And he said that the chairman had thought that he had a job for me. I said, I don't think he can give me all the benefits I'm getting here. And he says, well, put it in your proposal. So I did, the housing allowance and all these vacations to the States and all that. And he accepted me. And I wound up working as the international sales director and assistant to the general manager at the Ambassador Hotel. This is January 79.
This is the one right up the hill from what's now Chungmuro and what is it, Donggukdae.
Yeah, right by the Dongguk University. Yeah. I worked there when President Park was assassinated. I wasn't with the military. I was outside. And the Japanese stopped coming to Korea for tourism. The signs at the Narita said, travel to Korea at your own risk. And so a lot of the Japanese that had planned to come stopped coming. That was in October. Then in December, General
And
Chun.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but so Japanese were your main clients at the Ambassador Hotel?
Majority,
back then?
yeah, majority. And so then the shootout with General Chun Duan and General Chung, the 4-star
Yeah.
chief of staff, in December, our tourism was starting to rebound, and then that stopped it. And then we had to go on another offensive to get more tourists and say, okay, things are cooled down now. It's January and February and so on. And then the Gwangju rebellion in May. So the management had to tell us, hey, guys, we can't afford to keep you because we're just not making the profit. So 20 members of the advisory board, general manager and myself were let go. I wound up going to work for the Neja Hotel, previously located in Neja-dong, down by the Gyeongbok Palace, the predecessor of the Dragon Hill. That was where we had the soldiers to come on their own free time, rest and recuperation. It was called an AFRC. So I worked there for 9 months as their PR guy. And my father passed away. So then I went back to the United States, stayed with my mother for a good while, about 9 months or so. I applied back for my old job with public affairs, came back to the same position. And so George Kim enjoyed having me work for him. He extended me. Every 2 years would come up. I got extended. In fact, I was extended for 22 years under this 5-year limitation program. And then in 93, I became public affairs officer for 34 Support Group, which was Yongsan Garrison and the 27 installations related to us. And I did that from 1993 until 2004. And then in 2004 to 2007, I was GS-13 for IMCOM Korea, which had all of the installations for the Army. As a public affairs officer for 34 Support Group, I was responsible for the publication of a weekly newspaper called Seoul Word. Now, Seoul Word no longer exists. It went out of publication in September of 2002. So it was a weekly, and we had it up to 32 pages a week. That was a lot of coverage.
Did you enjoy it?
Oh, I did, immensely. But then I had to be, I couldn't get a 2-year extension. I'd already been 22 years. So I was told to go on the PPP, Priority Placement Program, and my next assignment was Sacramento for the Corps of Engineers as public affairs officer there. And I worked there for a year and a half.
What was that like living in the U.S.? Because that had been the longest time that you had been in the U.S. Before. You said it was just a few months when you were in Santana.
On vacation, yeah.
On a vacation, but
Yeah.
Korea was your base, but now you're going there for 18 months. Was it difficult to adjust?
It was, very much so, because everything is Yongsan-centric. Back in the States, it's not one place. There's no wall. There's no gate to go through. That you're in a 14-story building. You pay for parking, $80 a month. They didn't have the PX and commissary. They had them, but I had to go find them. Well, I'm sure there was other places where, I could get maybe something the same price or maybe even less. But I was accustomed to it. I felt comfortable. And so I continued to shop in those places for things I needed.
Socially, or just from day-to-day life, what was the biggest difference that struck you living back in the States?
It's just different. I was no longer in a military environment. I was in a complete civilian organization. We had 6 military in all of the 860 employees. It's not that I didn't enjoy it. It's just that I was estranged from my normal environment. And they didn't like the fact that I came from Korea. They didn't like the fact that I was with the Army, surrounded by military. So when I came back, my attitude was different than what they had. But the experiences I had, they say, look, that doesn't work over here. This is Sacramento. This is the Corps of Engineers. We don't, nothing from your military background is going to help you here. So I said, wow. And so it worked. But, after a year and a half, I had attained my 42 years, which qualified me for 80% of my retirement. And I said, hey, that's cool. I think I'm going to retire.
Congratulations.
And so then I went to spend more time with my mother down in Yorba Linda around Anaheim, and then wanted to come back with my wife, come back to Korea, because I felt more comfortable. In Korea, we get to enjoy a lot of benefits and privileges as a retired individual that maybe some other nations that we have military in do not offer. And I thought, hey, this is cool. And I love the military medical service. That's great.
Very important for a retiree.
Yes.
I imagine.
Yes. It's amazing what they've done. They referred to it as a miracle on the Han River, and that's true. I think once the Korean people set their mind to something, they can really develop it and hone it.
You continue to mention the work ethic of Koreans, and I do very much agree with that. I don't think that there is a country in history that had such a low starting point and has now reached such heights in less than half a century. I mean, basically, over the time that you've been here, in your lifetime, you've basically seen that transformation, and it continues to impress me.
Thing is, they have a can-do experience, a can-do attitude. We can do it. I can do it. Give me the time, give me the resource, and I can do it for you. And they've accomplished so much. You know, for the 88 Olympics, I had a friend who was given property on the Olympic park, and he built the Olympic Cultural Center. I believe it took him only, I think it was 7 or 8 months to build that thing. It was a 2-story structure. It was a U-shape. Mm-hmm. And it was at that venue where they had the entertainment performed at nighttime, every other night. They had the Brazilians did their thing, then they had the Americans did their thing, they had the Koreans did their thing in his facility. He had a 3D theater over there, huge screen, you know. And he had a dinosaur exhibit on the first floor. He had a space exhibit on the second floor. And I said, gee, this is unbelievable. The guy was ahead of his time, quite frankly. But it was amazing.
Yeah, the Olympics were really a coming out party for Korea to show the world this is how far we've come and this is how far we can go.
Well, I thought that too. I thought the 88 Olympic is going to blow the door wide open. It didn't. You know what did? The Japan-Korea 2002 World Cup. Because here's the difference. In the Olympics, the nations participated had athletes that could compete. Not every nation has athletes that could compete. But for World Cup, all you have to do is kick a rock in a sand pit. You know what I mean? Anybody can kick a ball. So every nation has got kids.
Except for the Americans against Trinidad and Tobago.
Well, we call it soccer. Yeah. See, that was our first mistake. Yeah. We should call it football.
You know, it's really amazing you say that because, I mean, consistently doing this show and conversations with other non-Koreans, I mean, the 2002 World Cup is consistently like an experience that people mention. And, you know, we're 15 years removed from that, but people will still, you know, point to that as like a defining moment in how they viewed Korea, their experience in this country, what they thought of the country. You know, for many people, they would come here as English teachers on vacation, you know, just maybe as a casual soccer fan. And it was that experience in 2002 that made them want to live here and want to be here, want to know what Korea was about.
2002 was the beginning for a lot of things. First of all, the people said to themselves, I know about Japan, but what's this Korea? So the curiosity factor really rose when they saw this other nation connected and said, I got to know more about that. I mean, how did they get to, you know, compare with Japan to host this event? And so then K-drama was coming out.
Winter Sonata, 2003.
And K-pop started coming out, you know, K-style. And they just K whatever, and Psy hit the band.
Careful with that. We mentioned communist, Confederate statues and KKK in the same podcast. People are going to think we're talking about something totally different.
But it was K everything, seems like.
Yeah.
And people started really honing in on Korea. And kimchi now has a popularity it never had before. Many Koreans had settled in the United States in areas nearby military camps. Some had married Americans. So they went back and to get an odd job or whatever, to have something to do, they started a restaurant. But the Korean restaurant cuisine wasn't successful. And they found out that if they served Japanese food, they could make a profit. So a lot of Koreans went and opened restaurants. Korean initially converted to Japanese.
Teriyaki chicken. At least where I'm from, a lot of the teriyaki chicken places are owned by Koreans.
But then after this, you know, phenomena, Korean kimchi seems to have grabbed a hold of people. And so these restaurants are now going from Japanese to Korean cuisine again, and they're being popular.
Korea's cool.
And so
Korea is cool.
But if you go to any town now that has a military installation somewhere, you're going to find Korean restaurants. And it's amazing what they've done. L.A., Koreatown. That used to be between Western Boulevard in Normandy, Pico to the Wilshire. That was a small piece of it. Now it's all the way over to, I think it's 6th Street.
It's down to Gardena. It's way south.
Oh, yeah. Fullerton, Irvine.
Torrance.
Irvine is almost all Korean.
A lot of Chinese down there too.
But the Vietnamese has taken over to Garden Grove,
That's
which
right.
used to be Korean. But now there's
Just
a lot of
north
Vietnamese.
Huntington Beach.
Yeah. And so it's amazing the amount of Asians who now live in America. And so this issue of foreign immigrants coming into America and to brand any immigrant is terrible, because that's what built America. Trump and his ilk wouldn't be there if there wasn't an immigration that allowed him in and his family. I think portion of mine came over the Alaska route from Asia way years ago.
Yeah, ancestors of mine came from China not too long ago.
Yeah.
Yes, I completely agree. Asian immigration, all immigration, has made America what it is. I'd like to ask you, how did Korea make you who you are? How do you think Korea changed you? What kind of man do you think you'd be if you had never been here?
I'm an extrovert, so I'd probably get involved in anything, anywhere I'm at. If I were in South America, if I were in Alaska, if I were still in Anaheim, probably wearing a Mickey Mouse costume on Disneyland. I like meeting people. I say I've never met a stranger. I can talk to anybody. I'm accommodating. I don't look down on other people. My father was born club-footed. He raised my siblings and myself not to discriminate against anybody for any reason, because in his young age, he was discriminated against or laughed at or made fun of by people. And he said, that's not going to happen with you guys for any reason at all. And I feel like that's how I feel about being in Korea. They don't discriminate against me. I'm a Caucasian, stand out like a sore thumb in a country of Asians, but they treated me better than I deserve, I think. And I've got to repay that. I don't have the money to repay it, so I have to do it in kind. In some way, I have to show my sincere gratitude to people who treat me as I would treat them and want to be treated. And that comes from my father. And my father wasn't a rich guy. He was a humble person. And I hope that I show that humility to others as well as my father did.
Well, you haven't really been retired in the conventional sense. You're not out on the golf course every day. What kind of work do you do now?
Well, I found myself involved in a number of things, and they just come up. Somebody will say, oh, well, maybe John Nowell's interested in that. And so I taught English camp at Gumi University the winter and the summer of 2010 and 2011. And then a friend of mine who I had introduced to the Ambassador Hotel was retiring, and no one was available. And I said, oh, wait a minute, I'm available. So I said, Mr. Yu, why don't you tell them I'm available? So he did, and they hired me. So I worked for 3 years as the
back at the Ambassador.
Back at the Ambassador as a sales representative from 2012 to 2015. And then while I was working there, a headhunter came and found me and said, would you be interested in working at the Lowry's, the prime rib restaurant in Gangnam? And we had an interview, and I was hired as general manager of Lowry's. But, that was a pretty intensive job to get a lot of customers there and so forth. And I felt like maybe it was too much pressure, so I said, maybe more part-time work would be better. And then I'm approached by Mr. Chong here at Oriental Press to work here as president of Oriental Press and help him print and distribute Plus 65. It's a monthly magazine, anywhere from 70 to 150 pages long, published by the 65th Medical Brigade, whose headquarters just moved from Yongsan Garrison in October down to Camp Humphreys. It's a focus on medical treatment, emergency medical treatment, exercises that involve what they do to get people up to speed. So I think there's a lot of great information about health. And what we do here at Oriental Press is try to assist by giving them articles about the history or culture or customs of Korea. This past week, went on a tour with the Korea Tourism Organization to Pyeongchang and to Gangneung to see the Olympic venues. It was a fantastic
Are they
tour.
ready?
There's some minor little things that have to be done, not structural stuff, but decor, setting up the venues for the
Paint
various...
here and there. And...
Well, the media boxes in the stadium, they're putting that up now. But, I mean, those are just, stadium itself is done. And my understanding is that skating rink, the figure skating, hockey, and the speed skating are going to be done in that one venue.
So in addition to your work at Oriental Press, you're also involved in something called Yongsan Legacy Project. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Daniel Oh and Coco Cugat, his wife, were working on a architectural design for Yongsan after the military have left. What's it going to be? What will it look like? Well, they designed it like a park. 8th Army left last summer, but 8th Army is just one of the many headquarter organizations that resided here for years and years. Koreans would refer to Yongsan Bude, Yongsan Garrison, as Mi Palgun. And when the newspaper said last summer, Mi Palgun moves to Pyeongtaek, they all thought, oh, they're all out of Yongsan. That's it. Mi Palgun is gone.
Right.
But that's not what happened.
To their disappointment, I guess. Yeah.
Well, we have United Nations Command with representatives from all of the nations with that. And then we have the Republic of Korea Combined Forces Command, which is just below the UNC Command. Mm-hmm. Then we have United States Forces Korea, which is below the Combined Command. So we have 3 headquarters that are still here.
Right.
Now, when U.S. Forces Korea relocates to Pyeongtaek next summer, that'll be a huge number to go, but we still have the other 2 commands. And every time I've talked to anyone, the dates slip a bit because there's a lot going on. How long is that going to take? 2, 3, 4 years? I don't know.
Well, if Pyeongtaek is any measure, probably 15.
I think it's going to be faster than that because the embassy is supposed to take over a portion of Camp Coiner this month. I don't know what time this month, but they're going to start doing their surveys and planning out how they're going to build it.
Are they going to try to move out of Gwanghwamun?
That's the ultimate plan. That's what I understand. Yeah.
So where does Yongsan Legacy fit into all this?
Well, Yongsan Legacy was something that Daniel and Coco came up with because after seeing the plan for that to go, they said, there's a lot of stories there. That's a lot of lives, a lot of things that were accomplished at Yongsan that will be forgotten. Who's going to bring that all back? And so they said, gee, at a Yongsan Legacy, we could have people provide photographs. They could tell stories. They could give us all of the kinds of things that you don't get out of a building. They're an edifice. It's the people who occupied those buildings that need to talk. And so what the effort is to have people come forward. They could give us a lecture, which we've held 9 lectures so far.
So this is open for the public?
It's open to the public. So all they have to do is go on our website and...
Which is?
www.yongsanlegacy.org.
And if it's not, just Google Yongsan Legacy and it'll show up first or second result.
Oh, it's all over the web now. I mean,
you got a Facebook page and yeah. John, before we sign off here, is there any last comments that you'd like to share here?
Well, I mentioned earlier about a Katusa who turned my life around about 180 degrees regarding my interest in Korea. Well, his name is An Johan, and now he's referred to as Moksa, An Johan Moksa Nim. He was sighted until 1976. And in 1976, he had been married, had 2 girls. He had received an invitation to teach Korean language at Monterey, Public Affairs Office there. He had to go through application process and so on, and they required a medical exam. And during the medical exam, they noted that he had a vision problem in one of his eyes. And they said, we'll have to report. Well, the vacancy wouldn't be open long enough, and so he was refused that opportunity. And he would have been a fantastic teacher for that. Well, as things went on, he was going blind. And that was so sad because in Korea, if you have any affliction, the in-laws will push against it. In-laws said to their daughter, you have to leave this man. There's no future for your daughters. She was very, very reluctant to do that. She loved him very dearly. But the way it was in Korea in those days was, very hard. So she left him and took the 2 daughters. And in desperation, he tried every way and spent all of his money that he had to see if he couldn't fix his eyes. He even came to me and said, "John, could you get me into the one-to-one hospital? Could the optometrist look at my eyes and tell me absolutely there's no hope?" And so I went to the one-to-one hospital. The doctor said, "Oh, I can't treat him. He's no longer part of the establishment." I said, "No, I know. Just look at his eyes and tell him if there's any chance." And he put him in the chair, looked at his eyes, and he looked at me and he said, "Zero, not a glimmer." So he went back home, and then he attempted suicide. He put a tie around his neck, hung it in the kitchen on a rafter. He jumped off the stool. The nail came out, fell on the floor. And he's struggling because the thing is choking him, but it's not killing him. So he finally gets that off. And he says, "I can't even kill myself." And a voice came out and said, "Read the book of John, chapter so-and-so, verse so-and-so." His voice. And he said, "I can't read, I'm blind." And the voice came out again. "Read the book of John, chapter so-and-so, verse so-and-so." And it just stuck with him. He decided that suicide was not the answer. Now, his father is a pastor, right? But Johann was too proud to ask his mother and father to help him because they were a struggling church. So he found out that he was begging in front of the Seoul railroad station. And this shoeshine boy befriended him and took him home to his home, and the mother cooked food for them. An was so appreciative of that whenever he got collected these donations, people give, beggars. He bought a school uniform for that boy. And later on, he decided to take theology. And he contacted the Presbyterian Theological School at Passamiati. And he needed $3,000 for tuition. And he called me and he said, "John, is there any possibility you know the American Women's Club?" I talked to them. They come forward and gave the $3,000, paid for his tuition. He graduated, taught himself Braille, and then he met a young lady who he later married. She has 4 sisters, and they all helped him make a church in Miati for the blind. Now he has a church in Bangbedong, Sebit Kyoe, Church for the Blind. He's my first friend, my first Korean friend, and he's the one that changed my life around. And he's traveled to the United States and Europe, and while they were in the U.S., they had a son that was born. That son, David, has attended Yale University, and he is a success story. I call him my friend.
Thank you very much to John for sharing his decades of experience here in Korea. Thank you to Daniel O, co-founder of the Youngsan Legacy Project, for making the show happen. And as always, a big thank you to the audience. If you like Settlers of Seoul, please rate us on iTunes. It's the fastest way to help us grow. Show notes and bios can be found at www.settlersofseoul.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter at Settlers of Seoul. Thank you.